Amid the vast map of Asia lies a small S-shaped strip of land, modest in size yet bold in spirit. A place where every political move, every flow of investment, every diplomatic remark can ripple across the entire region. That place is Vietnam, a nation without nuclear weapons, without a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, yet holding something the whole world covets: location. For a long time, Vietnam has not only been a bridge between East and West, but also a crossroads where powerful forces collide, shaping a new global order. On one side is China, the giant striving to maintain dominance through economic might, military strength, and an ambitious Chinese dream. On the other is the United States, the superpower working tirelessly to reposition its influence in the Asia-Pacific, strengthening alliances and trying to contain an unchecked eastern rise. And right between these two forces, Vietnam, seemingly fragile, walks a surprisingly steady, calm, and resolute path. History once cast Vietnam in the role of battleground, from colonial times through the wars against America and China, and into a symbol of self-reliance in a post-war world. But today, Vietnam is no longer a victim of ideological conflict. Instead, it has become an active player, a strategic pivot in the great game of global powers. The question is, why is a small country being courted so fiercely by both the US and China? Why is a nation with no military alliances being received with full state honors at both the White House and the Great Hall of the People? The answer lies in Vietnam's position, not just geographically, but in its role in supply chains, maritime security, and the shifting architecture of global power. And if we truly want to understand why Vietnam has become an indispensable link in this global chessboard, we must begin with the South China Sea, a place not only of turbulent waters, but of geopolitical currents deeper than any ocean. The South China Sea, at first glance, it might seem like just a vast body of water with sun-drenched sandbars and an endless rhythm of waves. But for those in politics, economics, or the military, it is one of the most complex and sensitive flashpoints in today's world. For Vietnam, the South China Sea is more than just a resource. It is a living space, a history, a line of defense, and above all, a stage to demonstrate national resolve in an era where power lies not only in weaponry, but in controlling the flow of goods, energy, and influence. With over 3,200 kilometers of coastline, Vietnam is the Southeast Asian nation most directly connected to the South China Sea. More than 30% of global trade, nearly $5 trillion annually, passes through these waters. Ships carrying microchips from Taiwan, cameras from Japan, smartphones from South Korea, containers full of textiles, furniture, and electronics from factories all over Asia, all navigate through a sea where Vietnam is entangled in a territorial dispute with China. And it's not just about goods. Beneath the surface lies a massive reserve of untapped oil and gas, strategic energy resources that could shape the future of any country bold enough to harness them. Above the surface, these waters are home and livelihood to millions of fishermen, people who defend sovereignty not with declarations, but with every journey out to sea. It's no surprise then that China has gone to great lengths to impose its illegal 9-dash line, a sweeping claim that effectively swallows up almost the entire South China Sea, violating Vietnam's exclusive economic zone and those of several other nations. Beijing has illegally constructed over 4,600 acres of artificial land, turning reefs into islands, islands into bases, then building airstrips, deploying missiles, and stationing Coast Guard vessels, as if this were divinely ordained Chinese territory. In response, Vietnam has not stood idly by. Hanoi has reclaimed over 2,300 acres, upgraded defense infrastructure, ensured a regular law enforcement presence at sea, and consistently reasserted a firm stance. Vietnam's sovereignty is indisputable, and all unilateral impositions are unacceptable. But the South China Sea is not just a sovereignty issue. It is also where Vietnam must demonstrate its strategic finesse in a much larger game. One being closely watched by the US, Japan, India, the EU, and more. Every move Vietnam makes here sends ripples across the global geopolitical chessboard. No one wants war, but no country dares to look away from this region. And it is precisely from these turbulent waters that Vietnam's central role in the global supply chain becomes clear. Without maritime security, sustainable trade cannot exist. And without an independent and stable Vietnam, no one can reliably safeguard one of the world's most vital shipping routes. This is where the story begins to shift, from power at sea to power at the negotiating table, from fleets to factories, from radar stations to industrial parks. Because in the 21st century, the fate of the world is shaped not only by warships, but by capital, technology, and economic strategy. And in that arena, Vietnam continues to play a pivotal role. If the South China Sea is the front line where sovereignty and national resolve are tested, then trade and investment are the quiet yet powerful currents reshaping the balance of power in the region. For Vietnam, the economy is not just a pillar of growth. It's a strategic tool for breaking free from pressure, maintaining balance, and carving out an irreplaceable role in the emerging global order. After decades of reform, Vietnam has risen to become one of Asia's fastest-growing economies. But this growth hasn't come from internal strength alone. It's the result of carefully measured diplomacy, long-term commitments, and a strategically calculated place in global supply chains. When the US-China trade war erupted in 2018, the world began to view Vietnam differently. As capital started flowing out of China, Hanoi emerged as a promising alternative. With a young workforce, rapidly improving infrastructure, and a politically stable environment. In just a few short years, Vietnam has become a production hub for electronics, textiles, furniture, and high-tech components. Samsung, the South Korean giant, now produces 40% of its global smartphones in Vietnam, employing over 200,000 workers. Intel operates one of the world's largest chip packaging plants in Ho Chi Minh City. Lego has invested over $1.3 billion in a carbon-neutral factory in Binh Duong, and major players like Apple, Foxconn, Nike, Adidas, and Panasonic have all established or expanded operations here. Vietnam is no longer just a cheap workshop. It has become an essential link in the global value chain. Yet no path to power comes without a price. Alongside the surge of capital has come a wave of skepticism. The US began to ask, is Vietnam becoming a transit hub for Chinese goods disguised to avoid tariffs? Are parts and components shipped from Guangdong, Shenzhen, Tianjin, and assembled in Bac Ninh or Haiphong simply a clever workaround? And could Vietnam's heavy reliance on Chinese raw materials make it vulnerable to future economic leverage? Hanoi is well aware of these risks and has been steadily diversifying. It has signed trade agreements with the EU, deepened negotiations with the US, and expanded ties with India, Japan, and ASEAN countries. But no matter how the pivot plays out, one principle remains constant. Vietnam will not trade its sovereignty for short-term gain. Every economic decision, from FDI policy to trade cooperation, is weighed on the geopolitical scale. Because the Vietnamese understand no economy can be truly sustainable if it is dependent, manipulated, or steered from the outside. And that's when the story shifts, from trade balances to national self-determination. Behind the modern factories and impressive growth figures lies a history of resistance, the memory of wars fought for freedom, the indomitable spirit etched into the nation's soul. And from that comes a principle that cannot be broken, that no matter who Vietnam partners with or where the investment comes from, it will remain true to itself. No alliances for confrontation, no compromises for survival, but a steadfast identity like bamboo rooted deep in the storm. That is not just a strategy, it is a legacy. It is no coincidence that Vietnam has managed to maintain its independent stance through the sweeping upheavals of the 20th and 21st centuries. Behind every policy decision today lies a legacy steeped in blood and tears, a history where every invasion forged a deeper sense of sovereignty, and every act of coercion only strengthened the spirit of resilience. To the Vietnamese, sovereignty is not some abstract legal concept. It is part of their national identity, a thread connecting the Le and Tran dynasties, the victory at Ngoc Hoi Dong Da, the coastal gun battles of 1974, and the border resistance of 1979. After over 1,000 years under Chinese rule, the Vietnamese have engraved into their collective memory a hard-earned truth. Without self-determination, there can be no lasting peace. That lesson isn't just written in history books. It's woven into the very fabric of Vietnamese culture, in poems, lullabies, border markers, and the sails of fishermen. While many small nations have chosen to lean to one side in search of protection, Vietnam has chosen to stand tall, open to cooperation with all, but submissive to none. That's why Vietnam's bamboo diplomacy has become such a powerful symbol. Like bamboo, supple at the top but firm at the root, it bends in the wind but never breaks. Vietnam welcomes investment from China but does not allow military bases. It is ready to sign strategic agreements with the US, yet firmly declines military alliances. Always open to partners, but never at the cost of its identity. That is the strength of a nation that knows the line between cooperation and dependence, between flexibility and surrender. It is this very spirit that has carried Vietnam through countless political storms, from colonial rule to the Cold War, through threats to its economy and sovereignty. And it is that same spirit that has made Vietnam one of the rare nations able to maintain strategic independence while balancing relations with major powers, without sacrificing its national honor or the well-being of its people. But in a world where diplomatic statements are increasingly hollow, words alone are not enough. To protect its identity, Vietnam must possess real strength and be prepared to show that if pushed to the edge, this country is willing to do more than just voice its objections. That's when diplomatic resolve must be backed by defense capability. And from the outpost islands to distant reefs, Vietnam is quietly and steadily reinforcing that message. Without fanfare, without spectacle, but with unwavering determination. Vietnam's flexibility in diplomacy has never meant surrendering its ability to defend itself. On the contrary, precisely because it chooses no sides and relies on no military alliances, Vietnam is all the more compelled to strengthen its own defense posture. In a region where tensions can ignite from something as small as a maritime collision, a sovereignty claim, or even a misdrawn map, military capability is not a tool for aggression, but a shield for peace. A declaration that Vietnam is ready to cooperate, but will never capitulate. In recent years, Vietnam has quietly modernized its island and maritime defense forces at key outposts like Ba Khe Shoal, Big Spratly Island, and Nam Yet. Reinforced structures, supply ports, radar systems, improvised airstrips, and logistical depots have been steadily built. No grand displays, no loud proclamations, but enough to send a clear message: sovereignty is not up for negotiation. And if necessary, Vietnam has the capacity to defend every inch of sea, every submerged reef, every emerging island, not just with words, but with action. At the same time, international support has been tactfully woven into Vietnam's defense strategy. The US has provided Coast Guard vessels, training aircraft, and maritime surveillance equipment. Japan is helping develop seaport infrastructure and a non-China dependent logistics chain. India has transferred missile frigates and supported officer training. France, an emerging partner, is expanding cooperation in defense technology. Yet all of this support takes place within the consistent framework of Vietnam's principle of strategic autonomy, accepting help to strengthen national capacity, never to become anyone's pawn. This diversification in military cooperation, from equipment to training, has helped Vietnam avoid dependency traps. No single nation dictates Vietnam's military strategy, yet every nation wants to be part of the regional balance that Vietnam is helping to shape. And amid rising tensions in the South China Sea, it is precisely Vietnam's calm yet firm military strategy that helps deter conflict and upholds its reputation as a responsible guardian of regional security. Still, defense power cannot stand without the backing of wise diplomacy, because while weapons can prevent war, only diplomacy can preserve lasting peace. And amid the strategic calculations of global powers, Vietnam is practicing a vital art, as supple as bamboo, as fluid as water, yet never losing itself. From here, the bamboo diplomacy strategy steps into the light, not just as a tactic, but as a survival philosophy in an era where the fate of small nations depends not only on strength, but on the courage to stay true amid turbulent currents. In today's unpredictable world, where borders are no longer just lines on a map, but lie embedded in every cooperation agreement, every diplomatic statement, Vietnam has chosen a very distinct path, the path of the bamboo, flexible to survive yet never uprooted. It is no coincidence that Vietnam's three no's policy, no military alliances, no foreign bases on its soil, and no siding with one country against another, has remained the cornerstone of its foreign relations for decades. While many small nations are swept into the tides of great power rivalries, Vietnam maintains a careful distance, close enough to cooperate, far enough to remain untangled. That distance is not indifference, it is clarity. Vietnam does not stand outside the world, but it also refuses to let the world make decisions on its behalf. Vietnam's diplomatic strategy is shaped not only by reason, but by hard-earned historical lessons. Having been used, abandoned, and betrayed in the past, Vietnam knows that in moments of survival, only one's own strength truly endures. That is why every handshake is measured, every partnership has boundaries, and every promise is examined with caution. Seen through that lens, every move Hanoi makes becomes a rare exercise in balance. Signing a comprehensive strategic partnership with the US while still welcoming the Chinese president with full ceremonial honors. Deeply engaging in economic frameworks like CPTPP and RCEP while maintaining independence in bilateral agreements. Supporting the rule of law without becoming an instrument of any superpower's imposed order. Vietnam does not raise its voice, does not point fingers, but it also does not remain silent when national interests are threatened. This is how a small nation preserves its dignity on the global stage. It is this calm resolve that has earned Vietnam a reputation as a trustworthy third party, a country both the US and China seek to maintain stable relations with, a transit point of interests, capable of dialogue with all sides. In a world where trust is increasingly rare, that very trust becomes a form of power, quiet yet enduring. And from that trust, from the ability to maintain balance amid global turbulence, Vietnam has risen beyond the role of a borderland to become a fulcrum, not just a pillar of peace in Southeast Asia, but a pivot in global supply chains, in regional security architecture, and in the geopolitical mindset of the 21st century. Vietnam, from its humble geographic position, is stepping into a central role, not with noise, but with the quiet weight of clarity. There are nations born with vast territories, populations in the hundreds of millions, and abundant natural resources. And then there are nations that need none of that, yet still command the world's attention, simply because they sit at the intersection where the currents of global power converge. Vietnam is one such nation. From a narrow stretch of land along the South China Sea, Vietnam is stepping beyond geographic definition to become a vital link in the world's emerging architecture. Vietnam's strength doesn't come from nuclear weapons or aircraft carrier fleets. It lies in its power to connect, east and west, past and future, stability, and the desire for transformation. In an era where global supply chains are being reshaped, Vietnam has emerged as an unmissable destination, from electronics components, textiles, and food products to semiconductor technology. Every container leaving the ports of Cat Lai, Haiphong, Da Nang carries more than just goods. It carries a signal of a nation in motion, shifting from the sidelines to the center. It is no coincidence that some of the world's leading corporations have chosen Vietnam as the site for their strategic factories. No coincidence that the world's largest trade agreements, from CPTPP to the EVFTA, bear Vietnam's signature. And it is certainly no coincidence that major powers like the US, Japan, India, and France are lining up to establish strategic partnerships with Hanoi. They understand that in a world increasingly fractured by rivalry and suspicion, an independent, stable, and forward-looking nation is an invaluable asset. Vietnam is no longer a country in between. It is a country that connects, not just in terms of geography, but in values, interests, and aspirations. From its physical borders, Vietnam is becoming a strategic anchor, a place that anyone seeking to maintain influence in the Asia-Pacific must take into account. And in a world in flux, it is often the smallest, most resilient points of convergence that quietly shape the course of an entire era. In a world where giants scramble for every inch of influence, a small nation without a big mindset will forever remain just a pawn, moved at will by others. But Vietnam, despite not having vast territory or a massive defense budget, is charting its own path, one that follows no predefined order and bows to no invisible pressure. What sets Vietnam apart isn't its size, but its resolve. A resolve forged through centuries of struggle and now transformed into a vision for navigating a turbulent world. Vietnam's true strength lies in its ability to stay grounded amid the storm. When global trade fractures into opposing camps, Hanoi keeps its doors open to both the US and China, yet refuses to let either dictate the terms. As military alliances emerge across the map, Vietnam stands firm in its three-nose policy, proving that trust doesn't need to be enforced by arms but built through consistency. And as global powers pivot toward the Asia-Pacific, Vietnam often becomes their first stop, not because of market size, but because of a strategic mindset shaped by clarity and courage. That mindset is clearest in how Vietnam handles the toughest challenges. It doesn't deny reality, but neither does it spiral into panic. It welcomes cooperation, but insists that the final decision always rests in its own hands. That's not just a lesson for small nations, it's a message to the world that you don't need to be big to earn respect. You just need to be consistent, transparent, and confident in your own values. In an era where alliances are as fragile as thread and trust is a rare commodity, the quiet strength of a nation like Vietnam becomes all the more precious. Not everyone will see it, but those who do will understand. This is not a country standing outside the game. This is a country quietly helping redefine the rules. If you too believe that true strength comes from mindset, not just size, leave a comment below to share your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more in-depth geopolitical analysis, sharp perspectives, and the strategic stories that are reshaping the world map each day. See you in the next video, where we'll continue our journey through this ever-shifting world with open eyes and a mindset that never stops evolving.